So our job today is to walk you through the West Michigan economy and really try and dial down into what's happening here in Kent County and Grand Rapids, because Kent County is a very special place, and it has a lot more resiliency than some of the places that we have around Michigan. All right, so it's been a long year for you, a really long year. Anybody spend any time trying to chase down product that didn't arrive? Anybody spend any time worrying about inflation? Anybody have any problems with workers being poached because you can't pay them enough? All of those things are things that are going to be with you this year. And our job today is to help provide some guidelines for you or some mileposts for you so you can make better decisions as you go through the year. All right? So to help you have a little bit of confidence in how we've done over the last few years, this graph here is showing how we've done on employment here in West Michigan. So what we've done is we've taken what our predicted growth was, and we've subtracted out the actual growth. Okay? So if it is 0, we're exactly right. And you can see 3 times in the last 8 years, we've been exactly right. The gray and the orange bars are how much air the federal government has in actually measuring employment in West Michigan. So if we're between those bars, we're statistically exactly right. And you can see the only time that we've missed is 2020. So I don't know what happened in 2020, and I'm not understanding why we were so far off, but we were predicting a recession that year. We just didn't anticipate what happened. So I think that shows you we're getting pretty good accuracy on our employment numbers, and we get that because we start by asking all of you, and we build that into our model, as opposed to running a model and then asking you. All right. How do we do on inflation? So we were saying last year as we talked to groups that we would have right around 5% PCE inflation for the year. Okay? PCE is the measure of inflation that the Federal Reserve uses. You're used to hearing CPI. Add 1 or 2% to this to see what we were saying with CPI. All right? The actual PCE inflation was right around 5.7% for the year. We were off a little bit on the low side. Understand the consensus forecast in January of last year for inflation in 2021, so if you were listening to your national economists, was 2.7%. So I think we did a little better than that. All right? So what do we know about this year? 2022 will be the year where the pendulum begins to swing back, slowing down economic growth. I want to be clear here, it's slowing down growth. It's not reversing growth. There's a big difference here. So make sure that you walk away with the correct story. And, all right, so we're going to do this by looking at really 3 things for you. The first thing that we're going to look at is why and where we're at right now. Then we're going to be looking at the drivers that will start to pull back the economy for you. All right? And then third, we'll say how those changes will then impact us here in Grand Rapids. So we'll walk you through those sets of things. And then we'll tell you the types of things to watch for so you'll know if we're going to be right or wrong as the year goes along. Because lots of things can change. All right? So why are we where we're at? I don't think I have to really tell you this, but it's COVID and the COVID response continued to shape 2021. And interestingly enough, despite the uncertainty, despite the unemployment, continued to pull the pendulum to the right and really heat up the economy. This is really unusual in the history of slowdowns in the United States. The slowdown actually leads to a speed up at the same time. That's very odd. All right? So I'm going to take just a couple seconds here and go through the morbid graph of excess deaths. All right? So what we can do every single week is predict how many people should die in the United States. And the people who are good at this know how many car accidents are there, how many people die of heart attacks, how many people have cancer, all those types of things that people normally die from. And what you should see is on the far left-hand side of that graph in 2018, that's a bad flu year. So you can see during a bad flu year, there's a little bit of excess deaths for a short period of time. On the right-hand side of this graph is COVID. I am sure many of you have friends, or maybe yourself, who've said, well, we can't trust the data because that person didn't really die of COVID. What we can tell you is that lots more people are dying than we would expect to have die. And we know there hasn't been more car accidents or heart attacks. All right? And we can see that those increases in deaths happen when we have increases in COVID. Why do we care about this? Because we exit the public health emergency when this number drops back down to 0. So this is the graph you should be looking for to know when that COVID uncertainty starts to disappear. And remember to ignore the last 3 weeks, because it takes a long time for our hospitals and health providers to report somebody has died to the people who collect this data. All right? So be watching for this to go to 0. Right now, the math is very positive that it may reach 0 by the time we reach April. I'm an economist, not a healthcare provider. Do not base your healthcare decisions on an economist. All right. So, as a result of those deaths, the U.S. government reacted by creating a substantial amount of stimulus. So if you look over that entire last 2 years, that first bump in blue is an increase in disposable income. It happened when in the United States we had 15% fewer people working because of shutdowns. In Michigan, we had more than 30% fewer people working because of the shutdown in Michigan. But disposable income went up. We continued to have elevated unemployment the entire year. Disposable income stayed up compared to what it would have been. At the end of the year, we got that $900 billion increase in stimulus funds. And then in March, we got another one. So you can see that over the course of that time, the U.S. government pumped in $5 trillion of excess spending. The U.S. government normally only spends $4.5 trillion in a year. So it more than doubled the amount of money it was planning on spending. This resulted in amazing things, such as the bottom 50%. So if we look at the people in the bottom 50%, their wealth over the course of COVID increased 75%. And as a group, they have $1 trillion more today than they did before they went into the pandemic. All right? On top of that, we couldn't spend money because everything was closed. And if it wasn't closed, we wanted to buy a new car and we couldn't find one. So that resulted in a lot of extra savings. And that savings is there for this year still. We expect those lower income people will burn through that saving in the first half of the year. But those who are higher up in the game have better credit ratings, have better balance sheets, and are in better positions than they were before they went in, by and large. Not everybody, but by and large. All right? So this was accompanied then also by substantial monetary stimulus. And so we're going to switch over to Professor Day to talk about this stimulus and how that has affected the economy and what that's going to look like going forward.
Thank you, Professor Isely. Good morning, all of you, and thank you for being here today. I'll start off with the expansionary monetary policy that went into effect during the pandemic, some of the unintended consequences of the extraordinary monetary stimulus on the economy, and what do we expect to see going forward. Monetary policy is committed to its dual mandate of full employment and price stability. And therefore, when the unemployment rate increased to 15% in the second quarter of 2020, Federal Reserve brought down the interest rates from 1.58% to near 0%. That significantly brought down the prime lending rates, which is the interest rate on business loans, and especially the mortgage interest rates on home loans. Now, was that needed? Yes, absolutely. The economy was coming out of its first ever global pandemic in modern history, which almost at the beginning seemed like it could be a global depression. And therefore, the extraordinary monetary and fiscal stimulus was needed to protect the economy from going downhill. Monetary policy, the near 0% interest rate was intended to increase consumption and investment and aggregate demand, and it did. It did have the desired effect, but we had the opposite problem. It increased aggregate demand way more than what was expected and anticipated. It, so to say, stretched the pendulum far to the right. And the US economy seemed to be fairly resilient to the pandemic. Consumption and investment increased by a record high of 20 to 25% in the second quarter of 2021. And these two components alone comprise 80% of US GDP. And not surprisingly, therefore, the US real GDP improved remarkably with the opening up of the economy. This next slide compares the real GDP growth with the potential GDP growth. What is potential GDP growth? It's basically the GDP growth that is consistent with a stable economy, natural rate of unemployment close to 4.5% nationally, and a stable inflation of about 2%. Clearly, during the pandemic, the real GDP growth declined by 9.1% and then started recovering, but with the extraordinary monetary and fiscal stimulus, accelerated and speeded up and started growing at an unsustainable 12.2% in the second quarter of 2021, primarily driven by consumption and investment. And since then, we do see the economy slowing down. The economy grew at 5% for the year ending 2021. But what is interesting in this graph, as you can see, is the real GDP growth overshot potential GDP growth. And should that happen ever in the economy, the problems we see now is bound to happen. Supply constraints, worker shortages, price inflation, wage inflation. It's almost the auto-correction mechanism of the economy, like our immunity system. It has the ability to correct itself, left on its own. But of course, it takes a long time and it weighs heavily on the economy and has a lot of distributional consequences. So in the next few slides, I will be talking about some of the drivers that has already started its action that we saw in 2021. What are these drivers that is going to pull the pendulum back? And the first important driver is prices. Price inflation has been a cause of concern among consumers in 2021. If we compare the headline inflation and core inflation measured by personal consumption expenditures, which is the inflation measure used by the Federal Reserve, we note that price inflation, the headline inflation, stood at 5.7% for the year ending 2021 and 4.7% core in December 2021. One of the biggest reasons for this inflation has been demand-supply imbalances. On one hand, because of near 0% interest rate and $5.2 trillion of liquidity injected into the economy, aggregate demand has accelerated and completely overshot expectations and what we had anticipated. On the other hand, the pandemic led to supply shortages and supply constraints and has slowed down supply, limiting supply to respond to how quickly supply can respond to demand in the near term, therefore leading to the elevated inflationary pressures that you see there. And according to University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index, consumers expect inflation to be around 5% or more next year, and that's a problem. Inflation expectations is a very important determinant of current inflation. The higher the inflation expectations, it's more likely that consumers are going to spend today. It's more likely that it is going to increase demand today and therefore increase inflation even more today. So it's almost like a spiral. Some of the sectors that contributed heavily to the national level headline inflation has been particularly services sector, accommodation and food services, leisure and hospitality, and some of the other manufacturing sectors as well. And not surprisingly, West Michigan also follows suit and followed a similar trend. The top 4 positions have been, for hitting highest inflation has been taken by manufacturing, healthcare, retail, restaurant. Now, healthcare, retail, and restaurant are service sectors, and they're very sensitive to labor shortages, to worker shortages, and heavily dependent on workers. Manufacturing sector, on the other hand, is very sensitive to global supply chain disruptions. Shortages of raw materials are going to hamper, inhibit project completion. And the manufacturing sector is particularly sensitive to disruptions in the transportation industry. Deep sea freight transportation registered a 28% increase in cost in 2021. That has significantly increased the cost of production and manufacturing and many of the other sectors actually, and almost directly transmitted to prices paid by consumers. The next important contributor to headline inflation is home inflation. And housing expenditures comprise of 1/3 of total spending of US households. So it's a deal breaker. And at the national level, the home inflation has been 16% for the US economy. For the West Michigan economy, again, we see a very similar trend. In Grand Rapids alone, the home inflation has been 18% higher than the national level. An interesting trend that Professor Isely and me have been studying and noting is that increasingly there is this big subgroup of millennials who are moving away from rental apartments to newly purchased homes, which is leading to an increase in the demand for housing market. And of course, the housing supply is not able to catch up. As we already heard previously, there is a severe shortage in the housing market, which is leading to, again, the elevated inflationary pressures in the housing market. And finally, the third and a big contributor to headline inflation is wage inflation. And it's a big, it comprises a big fraction of firms' cost and therefore is likely to pass on through into the prices paid by consumers. If we look at the national level, overall wage inflation has been in the range of 3.5 to 4%. However, some of the sectors, such as accommodation and food services, again, the service sector, has witnessed 8% wage inflation, whereas manufacturing has been more in line with the national level of wage inflation. And again, the whole economics runs around demand and supply. The reason we see wage inflation is demand-supply imbalances in the labor market. Labor demand is at its historic high. Employers are finding it hard to fill in job openings. And labor supply, on the other hand, is at its all-time low. Labor force participation rate is at its all-time low, primarily because of missing workers. There are worker shortages, early retirement. About 1.5 million people retired early. There are missing workers because workers don't want to come back to work due to medical vulnerabilities or due to caregiving, or perhaps that the financial cushion was sufficient enough for them not to come back to work in the near term. We don't know. But we clearly see that the labor force participation rate in the US economy is at its all-time low. And again, with labor demand extremely high and very weak labor supply or workers available to take up the jobs, we see wage inflation. Now, interestingly, some of the sectors can easily adjust. The reason we see high wage inflation in accommodations and food service is because accommodations and food service and most of the services sector features what is called flexible wages. And it is they can adjust wage rates rather quickly compared to some of the other sectors like manufacturing. Manufacturing sector features what is called in economics nominal rigidities or sticky wages. They have wage contracts, and it's very hard for manufacturing sector to revise wage rates almost immediately. However, we do expect, so you can think of the manufacturing sector operating with a lag. We do expect when the wage contracts go up for renewal, we do expect to see wage inflation even in the manufacturing sector. If we take a look at the West Michigan economy, we do see, again, not surprisingly, the top 4 positions that hit highest wage inflation are the services sector, media, finance, retail, and restaurant. And another trend that we observed in our research is that the wage inflation, interestingly, has been highest in the lowest quartile of the population. The wage inflation has been highest in the bottom 25% of the population and 20 to 25% of the population, and also among the age group of 16 to 24 years. And our prior view for why this is happening is because this subgroup of population is in heavy demand, particularly in the services sector, accommodations and food services, retail, restaurant, media. And it's and firms have to be, in order to retain them and in order to employ them, firms have to revise the wage rates and offer higher wage rates, otherwise they're out of workers. That's what we're seeing in West Michigan. Now, in this past year, the US economy accelerated at an unprecedented rate, unsustainable pace, giving rise to problems of price inflation, wage inflation, home inflation. And these drivers do have the ability to autocorrect the economy, bring down demand, and then bring the economy into the steady state. However, note that to start off with, to begin with, some of these acceleration was kind of initiated by the extraordinary monetary and fiscal policies. And the real question is, will policymakers now intervene to reverse what they did in 2020? As I said, the economy left on its own can autocorrect, but it can weigh on heavily on the economy, so policymakers might have to step in, along with some of the drivers, to pull the pendulum back and to correct the economy. And so the answer is yes, we do expect the Federal Reserve to step in and the federal government to stop any kind of extraordinary support to the economy. The economy doesn't need it anymore. According to the Grand Rapids Chamber and the Seidman survey, corporations in Grand Rapids expected prices or price inflation measured by Consumer Price Index to be about 9% in 2022 and wage inflation to be about 6% in 2022. However, here's the caveat. This may not have taken into consideration the fact that Federal Reserve might increase and perhaps will increase interest rates by 75 to 125 basis points in about 4 interest rate hikes. And that is going to slow down the economy. The Federal Reserve, according to the Federal Open Markets Committee projections and the Federal Reserve projections, inflation is expected to drop to 2.6% this year. And according to the Conference Board projection, wage inflation is expected to drop to 3.9% this year. Now, we at our end have also done time series econometric forecasting using what is called a factor-augmented vector autoregression model, which is common in monetary economics literature. It has the capability to incorporate information from about 120 or more macroeconomic indicators to forecast what's going to happen in this coming year. And we did this exercise at our end, and we find that a 20 basis point increase in interest rate leads to roughly a 0.50%, a 0.5% drop in inflation, which means if the Federal Reserve increases interest rates by 75 to 125 basis points, we do expect that to take away, to filter out, or to reduce 2 to 3% of inflation. And therefore, according to our time series forecast, we expect price inflation to be in the range of 3 to 4% in 2022. And using the same econometric techniques, we expect wage inflation to be in the range of 4 to 5% this year. It's rather hard to bring down wages. It's sticky downwards. When you increase it once, it's hard to bring it down the other way around. If we compare our forecasts with the Federal Open Markets Committee forecasts, we are pretty much in line, but I'd say that we are slightly at the higher end because we provide more room for upside risk. And one important implication that it has for the mortgage market is the following. If the Federal Reserve increases interest rates by 75 to 125 basis points, we might see an increase in the mortgage interest rates very conservatively hitting about 4 to 5%. It is already 3.55% since the time we started working on our presentation. And if the mortgage interest rate hits 4.5%, that boils down to a 20% increase in monthly mortgage payments for people, for individuals. That is surely going to bring down home demand and bring down some of the home inflation. Going forward, the next question is, how do some of these drivers that is going to autocorrect the economy, or that is going to, and the policy actions of the Federal Reserve as well as the federal government, how are they going to affect the West Michigan economy? And for that, I'll pass on the discussion to Professor Isely, who's an expert on this.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so we just went through a bunch of stuff which tells you that wages are going up, prices are going up, and that's going to slow down the economy. So what does that mean here in West Michigan? What are we looking at? What does slowdown mean? All right. So if we look at sales expectations, when we ask all of you, what we see is that there are still a big pile of firms that see that there's going to be an increase in sales above 3% this year. All right. But what we see when we average them all together is that the average sales increase expected in West Michigan is just short of 3%. So in fact, what the businesses are telling us is they're expecting their growth this year in sales to be essentially equivalent to what they had last year. What's going to be different is last year started out slow and then got really, really fast. This year is going to start out fast and then slow down as you get near the end of the year. Okay? Summer's going to be awesome, so particularly if you're in the service sector. All right? When we look at employment, what we see here is last year there was a lot of optimism by some firms that we would reach the end of the pandemic. Do you remember that last January? We're like, oh, we're going to reach summer, it's going to be done. So I feel a little sheepish to say maybe it will be done this summer, but we'll find out. All right? But last year we also had firms that said we're going to be losing workers. This year we're not seeing that. We're seeing firms really now start to believe they've got a handle on this, they know what's going on, and those that didn't are gone. All right? If you go across Michigan, somewhere around 40% of local restaurants and bars, not the big chains, but local restaurants and bars, went out of business during the pandemic. All right? We didn't see numbers even close to that here in Kent County. All right? So that's really good news for us. But what this tells us is that we're going to have continued employment desires, and the real problem here is going to be whether people can find the workers. And so we expect that actually this might slow down just a little bit more than people expect because the workers aren't there. Why do we have continued problems? We aren't building enough cars. Does anybody know Michigan builds cars? Yeah. Across Michigan, 1 in 5 jobs is still either directly or indirectly a result of automobiles. Still. We're less exposed here in Kent County. That's a good thing. We're producing fewer vehicles. And right now, the expectation is the total production next year is going to be equivalent basically to the production this year. But it's going to be different. It's going to be slow at the beginning of the year and then pick up at the end of the year. What they're seeing is different than what we're going to see, the euphoria that we're going to see in the service sector this summer. So the service sector is going to be really happy. There's going to be people wanting to spend money. Unless some new variant, the Zeta variant, comes through, the Omicron variant is going to have burnt out by the time we reach summer. At least that's what the healthcare folks are telling me. And we're going to be back to that beautiful summer of being able to spend money, go out, and get some food. So there's going to be lots and lots of spending there. It's just going to cost us more. When I presented on the lakeshore, I said lots of people will be eating ice cream in Grand Haven. And the person who sells ice cream said, yeah, but she was joking, but she said, yeah, but those ice cream cones are going to be $10. But here, what our problem is that the contracts for these second and third tier automotive are fixed price contracts. So their wages are going up, their supply chain costs are going up, their materials costs are going up, but they're not able to pass them on. And that's contracting margins and decreasing their ability to invest for the changes coming in automotive over the next 10 years. And if you haven't heard something, automotive is changing very quickly. So you need to be able to have powder dry in order to do that. The fear here in West Michigan is that will lead to mergers and acquisition and move control of some of these firms outside of West Michigan to investors outside of West Michigan. All right, we also have, you've talked a lot about the Great Resignation. In reality, I like to talk about the Great Retirement. So if you look at this graph, it's a little complicated, but blue is the change in the workforce since February of 2020, before we started. And orange is the change since April of 2020, when we were in our worst shape. Okay? What you can see is for older men, that number has dropped considerably. And in fact, it's even down from April of 2020, when we had all sorts of people not working. Think about that. What we're seeing is a sea change in how people across West Michigan and across the United States are thinking about retirement. And they're retiring earlier, and it's continuing past that initial surge. You can see for working age men and older women, we have had a big increase in their participation rate from April, and we're down just a little bit from February. But for working age women, those prime age women between 25 and 54, we're still seeing their participation rate lagging. So we know that there is problems with childcare. We know that there are problems with elder care. We know that there are problems with the service sector jobs that they were in getting back to work safely. This is the last group of workers we expect to be coming back into the market near term. And then we'll have a second group of workers coming back into the market this summer when their savings runs out. So we're really looking at two groups here. If you're looking for low-wage workers, you're going to have another good shot as you get to the middle of the year. If you're looking for mid-level management workers, there is a pile of women out there who are looking to get back into the workforce when we ask them in surveys. They just can't do it quite yet. So you need to be reaching out and finding ways to connect with those women so when they do come back, they're thinking about your company, not somebody else's. All right? So what we have is we're really running hot because we spent a lot of money. It's going to slow down this year because of prices, interest rates, wages, and we're going to continue to have supply chain problems, certainly through the first half of this year. That's going to slow our growth down from nearly 6% right now to probably here in West Michigan in the 2 to 3% range. But it's going to stay really fast for the first 6 months. It's going to slow down a little bit in the second 6. And you should be watching very carefully what the Federal Reserve does. Because if they do it wrong, it puts us into problems. And we may be skiing down the slope too fast and break our leg. All right? So we know that corporations are also a little worried about this year because their confidence for the coming year is actually below the confidence they had going into last year. A lot of this is COVID fatigue, but it means that they're still not sure that they can go in and invest as fast as they want to. Holding back on investing is going to be one of the biggest problems firms have for adapting to all the changes that are about to happen. And we know even if you have to change your office, changing your office to hybrid work requires different furniture, it requires a different setup, it requires a different way that it works around. That's good news for our furniture business, so that could be good news as we go through that. Okay, so what do you watch? Don't watch unemployment, the numbers are garbage. Okay. They made a correction mid-year, which makes them non-comparable with the previous parts of the year, so don't spend time on it. Do watch excess deaths. It will tell you when the uncertainty is about to go away. Do watch freight rates. It will tell you when the supply chain problems go away. Don't expect those to go away. Does anybody remember that we changed the trucking rules in 2019? Anybody remember that? And we stood up here on stage and told you that that would reduce the trucking capacity in the United States by 10 to 20%. And then COVID happened and everybody forgot that. Those rules are still there. And because of those rules, what would have been 2 or 3 trips a day to a truck to Los Angeles port is now 1 trip a day. And that's exacerbating the issues. All right? Do watch consumer consumption expenditures. I never watch consumers. Why do I never watch consumers? Because they're always wrong. But right now they have $3 trillion to spend, and if they spend it, they're right. All right? And do watch interest rates. If you don't see 50 basis points at the beginning part of this year, inflation is going to be higher than we said. All right? If you don't see 100 basis points during the course of the year, inflation is going to be higher than we said. And if you see more than that, your business is going to slow down more than we said. All right? So it's going to be a good year. Don't let us scare you, but it's going to start slowing down, and you're going to noticeably feel that as we hit the second part of this year. So why? The pendulum will begin to correct the overheated economy. So thank you very much for making it through all of this with us, and thank you very much to Kuhelika, Dr. Day. Sorry, I work with her every day. She brings a level of modeling to our price forecast that we've never had before and elevates what our team is able to do. So I really appreciate her efforts here. So thank you.